When I was a kid, there was a comedian. He had a show. It came on after the news. His name was David Letterman. He used to be a weatherman, and he was great. He was just funny. His delivery worked. It was quirky and offbeat, and he did this great job. He'd introduce a running joke. He'd kind of find the first thing that would work for the audience, and then if things went awry with a guest or whatever, he'd come right back to it. And he had little bits. It was kind of a variety show that made fun of the genre of variety show that at this point had existed for decades already. And one of the bits that he would do is the top 10 lists. He would write up these sarcastic top 10 lists of things. And I just thought they were random and funny and hilarious as a kid when I was allowed to stay up after the news and catch the first segment or two of Letterman. And eventually I got a book that had the best of David Letterman's top 10 lists. And one of them was something like top 10 rejected after dinner mint names. I might be making stuff up. It was something like that because one of them was disembowelment. And I thought that was very funny as a 6th or 7th grade boy. And another one was impalement. And so I went right off to school with that joke in my hip pocket, and I tried it on a bunch of people, like girls I wanted to impress, and they did not laugh at all. They just couldn't see the genius of the humor. All I can think is that Letterman's delivery was a little bit stronger. Eventually, I did get talked to by my teacher, and I was told to refrain from jokes where anybody got disemboweled or impaled. And in retrospect, it seems reasonable on their part, but also still kind of funny. Still, the real lesson here is there's no joking about things like that. So you can look forward to an episode here where we speculate about what the exact deal was with Haman's gallows that does not have the bunch of impalement jokes, which aren't even funny anyway. So I'm going to try to avoid those. Here's the thing. A couple days ago, we were talking about these gallows that Haman decides to build at the end of chapter 5 at the suggestion of his wife and his buddies. And these gallows, they're huge. I mean, they're just much taller than gallows would need to be. And I was riffing a little bit about how you really don't need 75 feet worth of slack to do a hanging. But generally, what we picture when we hear the word gallows is like in the Old West, right? Like if the stage just got robbed by Limpety Jim or the Snarkleberry Kid. Now we rounded him up with the posse, and now we're going to put him on a platform in front of town. And then the sheriff, the local lawman, we're going to do a little frontier justice here. We'll let the floor drop out, and then they'll hang. And I understand that's pretty dark, but I mean, come on, the Bible is the one who brought us to this point in the conversation because it's the one who started talking about public torture and execution methods here at the end of chapter 5. And, well, I think it's actually quite interesting and a completely valid point of conversation, given what we're doing, working through the book of Esther one little bit at a time, to consider how the original audience would have viewed this threat, like the original witnesses. I mean, what are they going to think when a 75-foot gallows go up? What would they even been looking at? What would a 75-foot gallows look like at this point in Persia? What would the original audience, the first people to read the book, think when they heard about this? What image would this conjure to mind? What meaning would this send regarding the transgressions and now the fate of whoever those gallows were intended for? But here's the deal. Even though we were kind of joking around about something more in the style of an Old West high noon posse robbed stagecoach hanging the other day, when we talk about a gallows in the ancient world, we're usually talking about a pole on which somebody would be impaled. As I'm just speculating here, there's all kinds of primary source original evidence to say this was one of the main means of people in authority killing their political enemies or rebels to make a point. What is that point? Well, it's don't rebel against me or I'll do horrible things to you, including desecrating your corpse. I'm not just speculating about this. We got all kinds of documentation from the ancient world that this was indeed their preferred method of execution in situations like this. I don't want to be gross, but I want to describe to you a little bit about what this looks like in as nice a terms as possible so that we can picture what Haman had in mind when he had these huge gallows built. The Neo-Assyrians were really into impalement, and the Assyrians were horrible. They were just the worst. They're the enemies of really both the northern and the southern kingdom. But the northern kingdom meets their fate at the hands of the Assyrians in 732. And the Assyrians took the extra time to carve reliefs showing, memorializing their impalement of defeated enemies and rebels. And I'm looking at one of these reliefs here. I've seen this one in person, but it shows two Assyrian soldiers with something that looks like a lance from like jousting in the Middle Ages. And they have impaled someone upon it, and they've clearly walked it vertical together and then stuck it in a hole in the ground. There's another one over here that shows like a rock or concrete base that holds the gallows in place to stabilize it, because the weight of the victim obviously is going to affect things. Now, generally speaking, I think of the Persians, who come along 2 empires after Assyria, as being friendlier. I think everybody would agree it was a better time under Persia than under Assyria. But even so, the Persians were really, really into impaling as well. Darius was into impaling. Xerxes was into impaling. Herodotus gives us accounts of Darius impaling people. In fact, Darius was so proud of his impaling that in that famous Behistun inscription, that stone inscription that he put up for the whole world to see forever, he talks about and even displays how he impaled rebels and people who promulgated the lie about the false succession that came after the era of Cyrus. After the conquest of Babylon, or putting down a rebellion in Babylon, maybe it was, Darius boasts about impaling 3,000 Babylonians to make a point of that. And further, we know that Darius, Xerxes' dad, the guy from whom Xerxes learned how it's good and proper to rule and what you got to do when people misbehave, Darius talked about his impaling practices in Ezra 6, when he found out that King Cyrus had indeed authorized the Jews to go back and rebuild the temple and so forth, and then interlopers had come and disrupted the process. Well, Darius makes an even bigger, even bolder proclamation about what will happen if anybody resists this rebuilding effort happening on the part of the Jews. He says in verse 11 of Ezra 6, "Furthermore, I, Darius, decree that if anyone changes this edict, a beam is to be pulled from his house, and he is to be lifted up and impaled on it. And for this crime, his house is to be made a pile of rubble. May God, who has caused his name to dwell there, overthrow any king or people who lifts a hand to change this decree or to destroy the temple in Jerusalem." So that sounds like Darius. I mean, that sounds like the language that you and I have been over, that he reels off in the Behistun inscription that we've talked so much about, that impulse to say whatever is decreed before by one of the kings should be held up by the successors, because he felt that his reign and his claim to power was a little bit fragile. And so he tried to prop it up for generations to come, making these kind of bold proclamations, demonstrating his continuity, looking backwards and hopefully in his mind looking forward. So we get that bit of continuity with the character of Darius, but then we also get the idea that clearly he thinks impaling is a threat that everybody will understand. He imagines that impaling crosses linguistic and cultural boundaries. I mean, pretty much everybody gets it. The visual cues are all right there. You wouldn't want that to happen to you, so don't do the things that the people up there on that stake must have done. What makes the most sense for me here in Esther 5 is that this gallows would be the most common approach to executing people, the most well-documented approach to executing people, particularly rebels, particularly people you want to make an example of in the ancient world and in the Persian Empire. So I don't think we're talking about an old Westy hanging, frontier justice kind of thing. I think we're talking about the sort of thing where what Haman wants to do is take a gigantic pole, run Mordecai partway through with that gigantic pole, and then use a series of pulleys and levers to crank that thing back up higher than the city walls of Susa even, to show people both inside the city and outside the city walls, this is what happens when you disrespect Haman. It's a horrifying fate and a horrifying image, and I think if we're honest about what this practice looked like in the ancient world, we better understand how this would have struck the original audience, and we better understand the stakes that come with that time crunch that we were talking about yesterday. And all the more so, we find ourselves turning the page toward Esther chapter 6, knowing that Esther is not positioned to solve this. This is going to happen before the next time she has access to Haman or the king. What needs to happen is some help from some outside source, like Mordecai himself had suggested would have to come along. What will it be? Next time around, we'll look into that and find out. We got a bunch of people signed up for the 1,000 episode party that we got coming up here in whatever it is, 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks. And I'm super excited about that. A bunch of you are coming to my hometown of Rapid City, South Dakota. And our event is taking shape in terms of details as we're getting a sense of attendance, who all's going to be here, both for the Monday, the 25th, when we do our evening 1,000 episode party, and for the following day on Tuesday when we do our much smaller, super adorable mini conference for pastors that we're going to have. Everyone who has signed up, we've got you on a list. We got the email addresses and everything, and we will be in communication with you, I would guess, early part of next week as we finalize those details. It's going to be so much fun. I'm so grateful for everybody who's up for making that trip. I'm also grateful to the rest of you for listening as well. And in your brain, you can just feel celebratory things during that time, and I think it'll mostly count. And final note here, I got to say that I think this episode was a huge win. I set out from the beginning not to repeat the mistakes of my youth, going around cracking ill-advised jokes about impalement. And here we are. We've made it to the end with no dumb impalement jokes whatsoever. And I think that's a gigantic win. All right, that's plenty. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.